Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. John Walbridge, to discuss academic freedom and what it means for our democratic society. Welcome, Dr. Walbridge.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Walbridge is a Near Eastern language and culture professor at Indiana University in Bloomington, and he's a member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is an assembly of faculty that are dedicated to academic freedom as the means to find truth and understanding about the world in which we live. His research includes Islamic philosophy, intellectual history, Islamic studies. His publications include recently a book called God and Logic in Islam, The Caliphate of Reason, and he's published many journal articles. Today we want to talk about academic freedom, so I think the best way to start, Dr. Walbridge, is why is academic freedom so important to professors and to students and to our larger society? I mean, I know right at this point there seems to be a push from some quarters in some state legislatures to limit the subject matter that can be taught in classrooms, and it's not just at the high school or middle school grades, it also spreads to college. So why is this of such urgency of importance to us?
Well, it goes back actually to about 1915 when at Stanford University, when the president of the Southern Pacific Railroad, whose money had largely paid for the university, wanted to fire a professor who was investigating labor conditions in the Southern Pacific Railroad. A number of the most prominent professors in the country got together, and a couple of things resulted. One was the American Association of University Professors, which really sets the standards for how universities academically should work responsibly. The other thing was the development of the concept of tenure. Okay? Tenure is essentially the idea that after a trial period, which is typically 7 years for people in higher education, a person should have either a permanent position or...
To get tenure, because I think this is confusing for the general public. Often it's seen as, oh, you got a job for life, like you're on the Supreme Court or something. But it's not that you get hired at the university and you stay. You have to perform in those 7 years, demonstrating that you're a competent teacher, that you are doing research that's of value, that you are an upstanding citizen and contribute to the university and public life. So it's not an automatic thing that you start a career at Indiana University and you can stay there until you're...
No, it's not automatic. And people who haven't yet gotten tenure live their lives in terror for those first 7 years.
Yes.
Until they get the final letter from the Board of Trustees saying that it's been awarded. But in my field and say in the humanities, typically what that means is you have to show that you're an effective teacher. You have to have, general, depending on the discipline, you have to have published a certain number of articles of a high quality. Usually in most fields you have to have at least published one book. You have to have another project well underway. Essentially you have to prove to the university that you're somebody that they would want to employ indefinitely.
And this relates, you started with Southern Pacific, this relates to academic freedom because if I'm in the process of getting tenure, am I reluctant to do research in certain fields on certain topics? Like if I was at Stanford researching labor rights at Southern Pacific, I might not want to do that because my job is in jeopardy. So I'm
right,
limited.
You might have wanted to switch to the New York Central. Really, there are two reasons for this. One of them is to give academics the ability to teach and do research freely. You don't want to tell experts what they should say. And that's valuable. I mean, we may come back to this later, but I'm in a field where there sometimes is political pressure. The other thing which doesn't get mentioned as often has to do with bringing good people into the field. I was in graduate school for 10 years. I could have gone to law school for 3 years and, this last 40 years or so been making a great deal more money.
Yeah.
But the fact that there's reasonable security in my position means that I can, means that the field can draw good people. If the pay is lousy, you don't get good people.
The question of academic freedom and whether or not a faculty member like you in Middle East Studies, or somebody that's in labor studies at Stanford, or somebody that would be in communication studies like me and would be wanting to investigate media monopolies or the dominance of a certain media framing on political issues, if I'm not free to do that research, or you're not free to do the research on Islamic philosophy or Islamic religion, that's going to have an impact on students.
Well, I mean, it's good for the students to be taught by people who are actively doing research. It's not like high school where you can buy the textbook and go on. It also has the benefit that faculty can take risks. So once I have tenure, if I decide I'm going to, if I'm a scientist and I have this great idea that might or might not work, I can pursue it rather than doing something where I know I'll get results, but they won't be important results.
Okay. So the big part of this seems to be the freedom to do the research that you want is going to contribute to the information that's shared in the classroom, and I would imagine in a larger sense it's going to be something that's available to the larger society. So for instance, if you were to say, don't do research on the coronavirus because it's never going to happen, whereas if somebody is actually doing research on there, it prepares us to know what mitigating factors can be taken, how it can be distributed, how you can protect yourself or an entire society. So it seems like there's some relationship between the freedom for you or me or some other university professor to do the research they want, and the results of that research, I'm presuming, gets shared with the larger society at some point.
Well, this is true. I mean, there's actually an ethical obligation to share your research. So there are debates within universities about whether it's appropriate for faculty members, for instance, to do secret research for companies or for the government. But your point is well taken. I read a fascinating article about the development of the coronavirus vaccine, tracing the rather harebrained ideas that in one way or another had made it possible. People who had tried things that didn't work for what they wanted or didn't seem to go anywhere, but all of a sudden they all came together in a very unexpected way.
And that knowledge is something that we need as a larger society to be able to deal with something as dramatic and as urgent as the coronavirus. I would assume the same thing could be said about other things that may be controversial at this point. Climate change, for instance, and the studies that talk about what are the pollutants that may contribute to global warming and what is the consequence of global warming. That isn't going to be popular in some areas, and I imagine you're not going to get funding from Exxon or BP, but still the research that's done, even if that challenges what might be, a majority opinion at a certain point, is information that we need to be able to continue human existence, I guess.
Yeah, and you don't want, the head of ExxonMobil going to the head of the university and saying, please tell that guy who's working on methane leaks to stop doing it.
Yeah. So I find it interesting. You're in Middle East Studies and you study Islamic philosophy and religion. What's the intersection here with academic freedom? I mean, is there an abundance of academic freedom in Saudi Arabia or Jordan? Or?
Well, there are two different questions there. There's how it affects academic freedom there and how it affects academic freedom here.
Okay, well, let's take both of them one at a time.
Okay, so academic freedom there, it depends on the country, but, well, I'll take an example, Turkey, where I've spent a couple of years. After the coup, there was a massive purge at the universities.
I had friends that got moved out, yeah.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah.
And when that happened, actually, I was basically getting ready to, pitch a exchange program with a university in southeastern Turkey that, for reasons I won't bore you with, would have been a fascinating place for our students. But the fact that all the key people had been fired
Right.
sort of
Yep.
gave me pause. In America, the issue is it intersects with politics, and particularly the question of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And
Oh, you mean for Middle East scholars that come here that may be Jordanian or Iraqi?
No, or American. It doesn't matter.
American,
I mean,
okay.
my field is both native-born Americans and people from the Middle East.
So do you think that the academic freedom is limited or more curtailed in Middle East studies as opposed to English or French or physics?
Well, it depends on how politically sensitive your field is. If it's politically sensitive, there's going to be problems with academic freedom. I mean, climate science is an example, Middle East studies, issues of race. These are the areas where there's likely to be problems. And sometimes they're just problems because people are human beings, and professors quarrel with each other.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen this.
Yes. Well, that's a whole other level of the discussion. But and when you think about Middle East studies, or like you said, issues of race, like African American studies or cultural studies at many universities, it would seem like if there is a limit to what I am free to do research in, that's going to limit what both my students who I'm teaching about this field and to the understanding of the larger society, to what we know, to what do we know about Reconstruction after the Civil War, or Jim Crow laws and the conditions that existed. If we're not free to investigate that, including ethnographies and data research and newspaper research, it's like, well, then it's a whole area that we don't know about. So it makes it difficult to address issues that may still be active today. And climate science is a good example, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it's our business to upset students. We don't want them leaving the university with precisely the same prejudices that they came with. I'm still unlearning things about American history that I learned in 10th grade American history.
Well, that would be one of the arguments why there has to be limits set on academic freedom, because what happens is people come in and they want to proselytize about a different interpretation of American history, which doesn't see it as this shining light on the hill or as this exceptional humanitarian nation, and that is dangerous for some. So what is if academic freedom just means you're able to do any research, make any claim, have any position that you want, what's the curbs on the side of that?
There are ethical standards. I mean, you have to be responsible in your research. You have to be responsible in your teaching. So, for example, one of the rules governing academic freedom is that things that are not germane to the class should only be taught or should only be talked about incidentally. And so I can give an example. So I had a graduate seminar on, I don't know, something in my field, and we had an election. Most of my graduate students were foreign, and so I just took the whole class and said, okay, this is what just happened, this is how the American system works, this is what these results meant, and so on. And, that's fine. If I did that for an entire semester, it would not be fine.
Or if you were advocating for a particular candidate,
Right.
which would be pushing the bounds.
Right. Usually in Middle East stuff, I will sort of try to figure out which side the class is on and be on the other side.
It seems to me, because you've published books which had to be reviewed both by the publisher and probably by external reviewers, and I know this is true for professional academic journals. I may advocate for a position, but it's not like it automatically gets published. There's what we call peer reviewers, so the academic freedom is kind of within the bounds of what's others in this similar field would say that's a legitimate method, that's legitimate empirical evidence, or that's legitimate qualitative ethnographic study, which I suggest it means academic freedom isn't like limitless freedom to do or say whatever you want, but within your field or within your profession and within the university environment, the academic environment, there are peer deciders or evaluators, I guess.
Yeah, in my own subspecialty, I belong to a minority interpretation. And so at one point, earlier in my career, I submitted a book to a publisher for a particular series that was edited by a man who's really probably the most prominent person in my field in the US. And he wrote back and said, I disagree with you entirely, but I'd like to publish this book.
Yeah.
So, that's how it's supposed to work. And you have to declare your prejudices. And
so there were a few things that we talked about a bit, which was academic freedom, and then you mentioned tenure early on when you talked about 1915 and Stanford and the universities. So does academic freedom not apply to those faculty like at Indiana that are not on a tenure track run, so they don't have any protections to do research or to teach as they have learned to teach or with the information that they have? Is academic freedom restricted to those people that have made the tenure? You got over that hoop, now you can do what you want. Before that, there are no protections for academic freedom, and for people that aren't on that, are there no academic freedom guidelines?
there are supposed to be academic freedom. There are, complicated issues of how it's applied, and before you get tenure, you have academic freedom. I mean, I had my choice of what I wanted to research before I got tenure. The only thing is I had to prove to the university that what I'd done was worth employing me until I chose to retire. For the people who don't have tenure, I mean, in practice, yeah, it's true, they have less protection. I mean, I can go to the provost and say he's being an idiot about something. My colleague who's a, second-year language lecturer would probably feel more nervous about doing it, but would have an equal right to do it, frankly. Actually, the thing that I'm proudest of having done in my career is working with non-tenure track faculty to establish their rights much more clearly within the university.
Does that codification of academic freedom, I know you mentioned the American Association of University Professors that kind of did codify what academic freedom should mean and what it looks like, but it's if you were to use Indiana University as an example, I imagine that would be different than the University of Chicago or Ohio University or some others. It's almost like academic freedom is not writ large, but it's writ by each institution everywhere in America. Is that...
Yes and no. The thing is that the AAUP standards on academic freedom and university governance and a variety of other things are essentially what everybody takes as the norm. If you are going to be a respectable university, you obey those standards. So, and the American Association of University Professors will sometimes sanction a university. Usually it's little Bible colleges where the president is God, but it happened to the University of Illinois. We canceled in my corner of the university, we canceled our connections with Illinois when that happened. It is a big deal.
Was this the Salida case?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, maybe quickly summarize what that was.
This was a professor of American Indian Studies who was strongly sympathetic to the Palestinians for reasons that make sense if you know both groups. And he was appointed to a tenured position at the University of Illinois, and was about to start. And then that's
And he had signed a contract.
He had a signed contract.
Yeah.
It hadn't yet been endorsed by the trustees, but that doesn't normally happen until after you're there and working. But that summer there was a war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and he was very angry about what was being done and said some rather intemperate things in tweets, which, by academic freedom, you also have a right
You have the right to do that publicly. That's not part of your university position.
Well, and even he could have chosen to also to say, this is part of my research. I'm comparing these two groups. But you have a right under academic freedom to participate as a citizen. But the trustees intervened under pressure from some of the donors and revoked his contract. And the AUP sanctioned the university, which is a huge deal for a university of that consequence. The trustee ended up the provost ended up having to resign, and the university backed down. There was a lawsuit, a good deal of money was paid, but in the end, actually, the guy's career was ruined.
Yeah, he didn't get it. He didn't stay
He never
in
got another
academia.
job.
Yeah. Sounds like something that happens to Colin Kaepernick and some
Yes, it's exactly like that.
Athletic protesters.
Yeah,
you can do what you want. We're just not going to employ you next year. So.
And no one else will either.
Yeah.
So.
Well, which suggests that academic freedom is fragile.
Very.
Fragile. It probably depends upon, and I don't know what a sanction from the AUP would mean. I imagine it's bad publicity for a while, but that was 7-8 years ago.
And then they cleaned up their act, and the sanction was removed.
Okay.
It's not something that a university of that quality would allow to continue.
Yeah. It would be hard to recruit other faculty.
Yeah,
I would think.
I mean, we were, not doing things like collaborating on, bringing lecturers and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we could talk more. One of the things about these interviews for Roundtable Perspective is the time gets away from us. So maybe we can ask you to come back at some point and we can talk more about the Middle East and Islamic philosophy and the rest. But I want to thank you for being with us and talking about academic freedom.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
That's all the time we have on our program today. I want to thank Dr. John Walbridge for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.